When Byron Donalds entered the committee room that day, he noticed something strange on Jasmine Crockett's desk. His own campaign brochures were sitting there. But these weren't normal brochures. These were the special versions Donalds used for black neighborhoods. Crockett quietly examined the brochures and looked at their content. Because that day she was going to expose Donalds's two-faced approach. He was saying one thing to white voters and something completely different to black
voters. The House Financial Services Committee hearing room carried an unusual tension on that humid September morning. The ornate chamber, with its curved mahogany benches and towering ceiling, had witnessed countless political dramas over the decades, but today's energy felt distinctly personal. Representative Byron Donalds of Florida sat at the witness table with the polished confidence that had made him a rising star in Republican politics. At 44, he was one of only 2 black Republicans in the House, a distinction he wore with pride and strategic calculation. His navy suit was impeccably tailored, his posture commanding, his expression conveying the kind of authority that came from being simultaneously an outsider and an insider in American politics. But as Donalds settled into his chair and surveyed the committee members, something caught his eye that made him pause. On Representative Jasmine Crockett's section of the curved committee desk, arranged in a neat stack, were what appeared to be campaign materials. His campaign materials. Crockett sat quietly, methodically flipping through the colorful brochures with the focused attention of someone reviewing evidence. She hadn't looked up at Donalds yet, but something about her deliberate movements suggested that this wasn't casual pre-hearing reading. What Donalds couldn't see from his position was the full scope of what Crockett had assembled. Her staff had spent 2 weeks conducting what they privately called opposition research in reverse, not looking for dirt on an opponent, but documenting the different versions of the same candidate that appeared in different communities. The stack included Donalds's standard campaign literature, but also the specialized materials that most politicians produced but rarely acknowledged. The versions tailored for specific demographic groups, with carefully adjusted messaging designed to appeal to different audiences' concerns and values. Committee Chairwoman Maxine Waters called the hearing to order at 10 a.m. sharp. Today we examine housing policy and community development in underserved areas. Representative Donalds, as our primary witness, you've been invited to share your perspective on federal housing programs and their effectiveness. Donalds leaned into his microphone with practiced ease. Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. I'm here today to discuss how conservative principles can better serve communities that have been failed by decades of liberal policies. It was a familiar opening, Donalds positioning himself as the voice of practical conservatism, speaking hard truths about failed democratic programs. For too long, we've approached housing policy with the soft bigotry of low expectations, Donalds continued, using one of his favorite phrases. We've created dependency instead of opportunity, welfare instead of wealth building. He gestured toward the gallery, where several conservative housing policy advocates nodded approvingly. What these communities need isn't more government handouts, but policies that encourage homeownership, entrepreneurship, and economic self-reliance. When Waters recognized Crockett for her questioning period, Donalds expected the usual ideological sparring about the role of government in addressing housing inequality. What he got instead was something much more uncomfortable. Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, Crockett began, picking up one of the brochures from her desk. Representative Donalds, I want to begin by discussing your campaign materials, specifically how you communicate housing policy to different audiences. Donalds felt a flutter of unease. I'm sorry, Representative. I'm not sure what you're referring to. These, Crockett said, holding up a glossy brochure with Donald's smiling face prominently displayed. This is from your 2022 campaign. Specifically, this is the version you distributed in predominantly white suburban communities in your district. She opened the brochure and began reading. Quote, Byron Donalds supports policies that protect property values and maintain neighborhood character. He opposes government overreach that threatens local control of zoning and development. Crockett looked up at Donalds. That's a pretty clear message about housing policy, wouldn't you say? Donalds nodded warily. Yes, I believe in local control and property rights. Excellent, Crockett said, setting down the first brochure and picking up another. Now, this is also from your 2022 campaign, but this version was distributed in predominantly black communities in your district. She opened the second brochure, and Donalds felt his stomach drop as he realized where this was going. Quote, Byron Donalds understands the challenges facing our community. He supports federal investment in affordable housing, community development programs, and home ownership assistance for first-time buyers. The contrast was immediately apparent to everyone in the room. Crockett let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Representative Donalds, these are two very different messages about housing policy. One opposes government programs, the other supports them. One emphasizes property rights, the other emphasizes federal investment. Can you help me understand which one represents your actual position? Donalds was clearly struggling. Representative, campaign materials often emphasize different aspects of a comprehensive policy approach. Different aspects, Crockett repeated. Or contradictory positions. She pulled out a third document. This gets even more interesting when we look at the Spanish language materials you distributed in areas with large Hispanic populations. Donalds looked like he wanted to disappear. Quote, Byron Donalds apoya programas federales que ayudan a las familias trabajadoras a comprar su primera casa. Él entiende las barreras que enfrentan las comunidades inmigrantes. Crockett looked up. For those who don't speak Spanish, that translates to, Byron Donalds supports federal programs that help working families buy their first home. He understands the barriers facing immigrant communities. She set down the Spanish language brochure and picked up the suburban version again. But remember, in the suburban communities you oppose government overreach and support local control. Which Byron Donalds should these communities believe? The hearing room was completely silent now. Other committee members were leaning forward, clearly fascinated by this systematic deconstruction of political messaging. Donalds tried to regain control. Representative, I think you're taking these materials out of context. Out of context, Crockett interrupted. Representative Donalds, these aren't quotes taken from different speeches or different time periods. These are campaign materials from the same election, distributed to different communities in the same district during the same month. She spread the brochures out on her desk so the cameras could capture them. You literally told different groups of voters opposite things about the same policy issues. Crockett's voice grew stronger. And this isn't just about housing. Let me read from your law enforcement materials. She picked up another set of brochures. To suburban voters, Byron Donalds supports law and order policies that keep our communities safe from crime and disorder. She switched brochures. To urban voters, Byron Donalds understands the need for police reform and community-based approaches to public safety. Donalds was now visibly sweating. Representative, these aren't contradictory. Aren't they? Crockett asked. Because law and order is usually code for more aggressive policing, while police reform usually means the opposite. She pulled out her phone and consulted a note. But it gets worse, Representative Donalds, because while you were telling black voters you support police reform, you were voting against every police reform bill that came before Congress. The accusation was devastating in its precision. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, you voted against it. The Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act, you voted against it. The Ending Qualified Immunity Act, you voted against it. Crockett looked directly at Donalds. So when you told black voters you support police reform, were you lying to them, or were you planning to vote differently than you actually did? Donalds was trapped. Any answer would either admit deception or incompetence. Representative, I think my voting record speaks for itself. It does, Crockett agreed. It speaks to a pattern of telling voters what they want to hear while having no intention of following through. She stood up from her chair, a move that surprised everyone in the room. Representative Donalds, you've built your political brand on being the authentic black conservative voice. You criticize other black politicians for playing identity politics and being dishonest with voters. Crockett's voice carried the authority of someone making a closing argument. But what I've documented here today is the most cynical form of identity politics imaginable, literally changing your message based on the racial composition of your audience. She gestured toward the brochures on her desk. You don't have a consistent policy position, Representative Donalds. You have a marketing strategy. The room was electric with tension now. This had moved beyond typical congressional theater into something much more personal and damaging. And here's what makes it worse, Crockett continued. While you were telling black voters you support federal housing programs, you were voting to cut those same programs in Congress. While you were telling immigrant communities you understand their barriers, you were voting for policies that create more barriers. Her voice grew more passionate. You've taken the trust that these communities placed in you, trust based on shared identity and shared struggle, and you've betrayed it for political convenience. Donalds tried one more time to respond. Representative, I think you're mischaracterizing. I'm not mischaracterizing anything, Crockett said firmly. I'm reading your own words back to you. Words you chose to put in writing and distribute to voters. She sat back down but kept her eyes on Donalds. Representative, there's a word for politicians who say one thing to one group and something completely different to another group. That word is dishonest. Crockett picked up the Suburban brochure one more time. But there's an even worse word for politicians who exploit racial trust while working against racial interests. And I think everyone in this room knows what that word is. The silence that followed was profound. Donald sat at the witness table looking smaller than he had at the beginning of the hearing. His carefully constructed political persona exposed as a collection of contradictory marketing messages. As the hearing moved to other topics, the damage was irreversible. Within hours, side-by-side images of Donald's contradictory campaign materials were circulating on social media, news websites, and political blogs. But perhaps the most telling response came from Donalds's own district. 3 weeks after the hearing, a coalition of black community leaders in Florida issued a statement saying they felt deceived and manipulated by Donalds's campaign tactics and called for honest representation over political opportunism. 6 months later, when Donalds faced a primary challenge from another black conservative, his opponent's most effective attack ad consisted entirely of footage from Crockett's questioning and images of the contradictory campaign materials. Because in politics, as in life, the most dangerous lies aren't the ones you tell about your opponents. They're the ones you tell about yourself. And sometimes the most effective oversight doesn't come from investigating what politicians do in Washington. It comes from examining what they promise to voters back home. If this story reminded you that authenticity means consistency, and that real representation requires honest communication with all constituents, make sure to subscribe for more stories of people who prove that the most important political accountability happens when someone is brave enough to read politicians' own words back to them.